Hi everyone, Mrs. Tolman back with History 1101, the Early American History course, and this module is titled Thinking Historically, the Revolutionary Generation, Thomas Jefferson. So clearly this week we're going to be reclaiming the legacy of Thomas Jefferson and beginning to think of him more in the historical context rather than looking at him in the lens of modern day media and how he is portrayed or how he has been portrayed recently. In February of 1826, Jefferson wrote to his longtime friend and political confidant, James Madison, that he hoped that Madison would be able to take care of him after he had gone. And what he meant by take care of him was that he was hoping Madison would be there in order to explain some of the inconsistencies that Jefferson had in his lifetime. Things specifically like writing on multiple occasions that he was anti-slavery and yet at the same time continuing to own slaves. And this ownership of slaves has been what has really made Jefferson, among other founding fathers, the figure of intense criticism and calls for the removal of his name from monuments, tearing down statues to him, things that we saw especially over this past summer, really trying to kind of wipe out reminiscences of early America and specifically anyone that was involved with slave holding or slave trading. And so what we're really trying to do is to get past looking at them with our modern societal norms, and to look at them within the context of the time period that they lived. Because Jefferson was not a man of 2020. He was a man of the late 18th and into the early 19th century. And so we have to keep him in the historical context of his time in order to really understand who he was as a person. And that understanding is what actually allows us to kind of start to make sense of why the government was established the way it was, what people were fighting for during the Revolution, and really opening our minds to understanding some of those founding documents. Because if we can't get past looking at Jefferson in this modern lens, then we kind of close our minds to who Jefferson was as a man within his time. Over the summer of 2020, we all saw countless headlines and different news outlets calling for the removal of statues, reporting on the destruction of statues. And one of the headlines that I kind of captured was titled, "As Statues of Founding Fathers Topple, Debate Rages Over Where Protesters Should Draw the Line." And one of the quotes that struck me was from a bystander, Tristan Crowell, who said, "When it came down, we could tell something had happened. This was a moment in history, at least in this city. And there should be a line at the Civil War. Every forefather prior to that should be considered a Confederate." And I think what struck me about this and what I'd like you to contemplate for going into our studies of the Revolutionary era is really, should we draw that line? Because there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the early United States, from the Revolution, digging deeper into the meanings of freedom and the meanings of liberty. And while those meanings within our context did not include the race of slaves or the group of people who were enslaved, that doesn't negate completely the meaning and their motivations, what they were hoping to long-term accomplish. And one of the things that I think people often forget is that these were individuals. These were not people who could force the entire population to their will, despite whatever their personal beliefs were. And I think that that message often gets lost because we look at them as an individual and ask, what did they do? But even individuals had societal constraints and legal constraints that they had to operate within. And that's really something that I want us to explore with Jefferson, because Jefferson was a man in that particular situation where he had personal constraints that prohibited him from freeing his slaves, but he also had legislation, laws that prohibited him from selling his slaves as well. And so despite whatever his personal beliefs were, he still had to be a man operating within the area of the law for the state of Virginia. Jonathan Pitts, actually, his headline put it more succinctly: while Confederate monuments are coming down, now what do we do about memorials to slaveholders like Washington and Jefferson? And so rather than looking at the men for the accomplishments that they did make, then we are excoriating them in the media today for things that were a sign of their own times. Washington, for example, inherited a large number of slaves through his wife, and Virginia law at the time actually prohibited him being able to free slaves that were brought to him through marriage. But people don't take that step in order to do the research to understand what the constraints were. And so all we get is a blurb or a headline, and we respond with this emotional feeling about negativity and the idea of slavery and how repulsive it was. And we can't get past those emotions in order to start digging deeper into the historical meaning. And that's why I really want us within this module to think historically, to keep these men within the context of the time period that they lived. So Thomas Jefferson had one publication titled Notes on the State of Virginia, and William Peden, who was an editor of a reprint of that book, noted that Jefferson attacked assumptions from society. He attacked the idea of societal strata. He attacked bigotry. He attacked the ownership of slaves, in fact. And while a lot of people might scoff at that and say, well, you know, so they're words on paper, the reality was, though, that for him to even publish that with his name on it in Virginia, which was extremely vested in the slave trade in terms of the labor that came out of it and the wealth that that labor created and generated within Virginia. He was taking a big risk. He was an attorney at the time working in Virginia. He relied on people coming to him for legal representation, and to alienate those people was to take a big risk. And putting that opinion out there certainly did have an effect on him within his profession. He noted in a letter to a friend of his, a French friend who had been here fighting in the Revolution in 1785, and said, in regard to the Notes on the State of Virginia, it is possible that in my own country these strictures might produce an irritation. Well, an irritation was kind of putting it mildly. He said, I have a view that is the emancipation of their slaves and the settlement of their constitution on a firmer and more permanent basis. So he was writing about his own personal beliefs. Were those beliefs that he could force on other people? No, they weren't. Were they beliefs that he was hesitant to express publicly? Yeah, to some degree he was. He was a man like any other man, and he needed to do business with people in order to be able to survive financially. Certainly, his writing of the Declaration of Independence did not bring him a considerable windfall of money. And nor did the publication of notes on the state of Virginia. So, he was someone that had lofty ideas. He knew morally what he believed, but whether or not he was actually able to act on those beliefs is an entirely different matter, and something that we'll continue to explore. Part of the difficulty that Jefferson lived with in regard to slave ownership was the amount of debt that he had. People look at Monticello today and think, wow, that was a very wealthy landowner, and certainly he got rich on the backs of slaves. That was actually entirely incorrect. When Jefferson inherited land at a young age from his father, he inherited slaves. His wife brought slaves, which became a part of his plantation. But again, those slaves could not be freed because they were brought by his wife through marriage. But as he grew older, that debt actually never decreased. It wasn't like it is today, where the President of the United States draws a large salary. A lot of the travel, a lot of the expenses that they incurred during the Revolution and going into the establishment of the United States, those debts were incurred personally. They weren't something that they could, turn into the Department of Treasury and ask for a reimbursement. In fact, in the same letter that Jefferson had written to Madison towards the end of his life in 1826, he wrote very candidly about his debts and how those debts had been made public, and how it was embarrassing to him, how the land that he had inherited had actually lost value rather than gaining value, that for several years they had had really bad crop production, and that his financial situation was very difficult indeed. In fact, when he died with considerable debt and did not have property in order to release and pay all of those debts. So financial considerations was something that was a factor in Jefferson's life throughout his adulthood, despite what we may think today about the financial situations and the lives of luxury that the founding fathers may have lived. That definitely was not the case in terms of Thomas Jefferson. One of the things that often is not also known about Jefferson was that in 1777, he helped author legislation in the state of Virginia that would limit the importation of slaves into the state. And I have the actual wording of part of the bill here for you to examine, and a link to go and read further about this. The act wasn't put into effect until 1778, but what Jefferson wrote was that it stopped the increase of the evil by importation, leaving to future efforts its final eradication. So in essence, he made public his position on slavery through the notes of the state of Virginia. He helped author legislation to limit the importation of slaves into the state of Virginia. He made numerous comments about his belief that slavery should be abolished, but yet at the same time, that was balanced with the financial constraints and then the legal constraints that he had for freeing his own slaves. So really what I'm trying to do, and hopefully you will find in your reading, the continued kind of widening your image and your ideas about the founding fathers in order to keep them in their context and not to only think of them in terms of the headlines we see in the news today.